When was the last time you read a fairy tale, like a true fairy tale, not a garbage Disney princess wannabe fake fairy tale, but like the hardcore Hans Christian Andersen, Grimm's Brothers, George MacDonald type fairy tale? When was the last time? Do you remember? Well, today we are going to be talking all about fairy tales. What are they? Why it's essential that we need to read them to our children to help their moral imagination, and then what the best ones are, the best translations are. So with that, let's get started. Hello, and welcome to School to Homeschool. I am Janae Daniels. I'm a wife, a mother of 6, and a former middle school teacher turned homeschool mom. I have kids in their 20s all the way down to elementary age and everything in between. Are you thinking about pulling your kids from the school system like I did, but you're scared to death and don't know what to do next? My friends, I felt the same way, and you have come to the right place. I want to help your family leave the system so that you can take the hearts and minds of your children back. So let's get into fairy tales. Now, y'all, lately I have been super obsessed with fairy tales. I've been reading the book Tending to the Heart of Virtue by Dr. Vigen, Guroian. I also have been reading Bruno Bettelheim's The Uses of Enchantment, The Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales. He was a child psychologist. Dr. Guroian is actually a theologian and a professor of literature and religion as well, both. And then I've also been listening to the Literary Life podcast, which is fabulous. It's all about literature with Angelina Stanford. And she also is the co-founder of the House of Humane Letters. And she's a literary teacher that teaches everything from university level all the way down to middle school. Anyway, so I've been studying all of these people's works and have regained this fascination with fairy tales. And so a couple weeks ago, I was like, you know what? For this summer, guys, we tend to do like a light homeschooling during summer. We don't do it as heavy as we do during the school year. And so there was a few things that I wanted to do. I'm like, I wanted to do nature journaling and go on hikes. Spend a lot of time outside. I've got a couple projects that I want to do with you kids that are really fun, cool projects. And then I want to do read alouds, but more specifically, I want to study and read fairy tales. And this being inspired by Tending the Heart of Virtue and The Uses of Enchantment and Angelina Stanford's podcast. I've just been delighted. Now, as a child, I loved fairy tales. Like, I loved them. I remember in the 4th grade, we were supposed to take a fairy tale and then turn it into some sort of a theatrical form, which was right up my alley with my personality. And I chose to do Jack and the Beanstalk, and I did a puppet show. And I have very vivid memories of doing that in my class. And yet now we see, most of us don't read the original fairy tales anymore, the best translations. And we have this, moral corruption that's happened. And I think that there is somewhat of a connection between the lack of the true fairy tales being told and some amount of moral corruption in the imagination. So I want to discuss that today. Like, why do kids need fairy tales for their moral development? But I also, and I want to discuss that like into depth about postmodernism, what we've gotten ourselves into with this mess that we're in. And then I want to talk about some of the best translations that we can get that are the truest, without a lot of biases with politics. So we'll get into that. But first, let's start what is a fairy tale? Have you ever thought about that? Like, which is funny because most fairy tales don't actually have fairies in them. And so we get this idea of fairy tales from the Grimm's brothers, and the actual translation was wonder wonder stories or wonder tales. And I think that's probably a better way to say a fairy tale is a wonder story. Because the main thing is they have to have a sense of wonder to them. Sometimes they have magic, sometimes they don't, but there needs to be a sense of wonder. Some of the traits of a fairy tale is that they have to have a happy ending. Now, I know some of you are thinking, but like, if you look at like the true story of the Little Mermaid, that doesn't have a happy ending. Well, technically, that's not a fairy tale. That is a cautionary tale. And we're going to talk about the difference here. So with true fairy tales, they have to have a happy ending. The prince and the princess always get married at the end. And usually there's a child in historic fairy tales, a child is separated from their parents at some point, and they must overcome obstacles to get home. And so there's this reuniting, this redemption, there's a happy resolution. Those are the traits of true wonder stories, is happy endings, resolution, redemption, versus cautionary tales, which are equally as delightful and equally should be read, which don't necessarily have a happy ending. So some examples of cautionary tales, again, you've got like The Little Mermaid. I'm trying to think of some other cautionary tales off the top of my head. The Charles Perrault French version of Red Riding Hood. She actually gets eaten by the wolf at the end and no one saves her, which is interesting because we see Charles Perrault turning those into morality stories. Like when we look at the fairy tales, what the Grimm's brothers did is they would collect folk tales and then write them down. And there was universal truths that were taught. The Grimm's brothers were very, very religious, as far as like they knew the Bible very well. And so we see this transcendent truths in the Grimm's fairy tales. Sometimes they're not quite as didactic and preachy as we might see in contemporary translations of the fairy tales. Charles Perrault, who is French, the Grimms were, I believe, German, but Charles Perrault, who lived, I think he was in the 1700s, took the folk tales and then he rewrote them as cautionary tales to warn about immorality, which is what he did with the Little Red Riding Hood. Is, oh, if you get in bed with a wolf, then you'll be eaten, right? They became morality tales or cautionary tales, so to teach moral lessons, because he felt like that the French society had become very morally corrupt. And so he becomes very didactic in his retelling of the stories. But if we go back to like the original Grimm's brothers, the Hans Christian Andersen, and again, Hans Christian Andersen had both cautionary tales, but he also had wonder tales or fairy tales that he would tell. We see this transcendent truths that are taught and morality that's taught. And sometimes the fairy tales are appropriately named very grim, but they're still transcendent and universal truths, although they are not right in our faces. Which I think is interesting because I had not read the whole Grimm's anthology before of their full collected works until a couple of weeks ago when we started, which I'm in the middle of. And so our goal this summer is to get through all of the Grimm's fairy tales, the complete collection, and Hans Christian Andersen tales, and then get through some of George MacDonald's works, potentially John Ruskin. I'm working on that. He was a Victorian wonder story writer, kind of a Renaissance man. He did lots of things. He was also an art critic. But it's been interesting because, and we're going to get into the violent part of the fairy tales, but my kids have been totally mesmerized by the fairy tales. We've been listening to them in the car. We've had a lot of places that we've had to go. And so as soon as we get in, even my teenagers are like, can you turn on the fairy tales? And I forgot how delightful they are. And at the same time, some of them I'm like, oh my gosh, they're so gruesome. Some of them are so gruesome. And many I had never heard in my life, ever. But there's something magical and delightful about them that my kids just like any chance we get that we get a break, they want to listen to the fairy tales. And even I was cooking and my kids were like, is the speaker working? And my speaker had died that connects to my phone in the kitchen. And so I'm like, no, the speaker's not working. And they're like, we want to listen to some more fairy tales. And I'm like, wow, these tales are just pulling my kids in, which is pretty cool. But why do we need to read them to kids? I believe, and this is something that Dr. Guroian argues in his book, Tending to the Heart of Virtue, which is all the books I'm referring to are fabulous, is that we've lost moral imagination. And this idea of morality has become very, very corrupt. And we know why. Our society has embraced the postmodern movement. Now, if you're not familiar with what postmodernism is, it is a rejection of universal truth. It's a rejection of objective reality. There is no good. There is no bad. Everything is relative. There's my truth versus your truth, and there is no the truth. And we're not talking about perspective, like my perspective versus your perspective. We're talking about universal truth, right? And we see this. I mean, we see this politically. I'm going to get a little bit political right now. I was just on Instagram this morning, and there was another controversy over a biological boy taking over, winning all of the medals for a girls' sport in California. And there's all this argument that there's, well, he feels like he's a girl, so therefore he is a girl. This idea of objective truth has been thrown out the window, and we're seeing this in schools. And it is a dangerous, to have no objective truth it's a dangerous ideology, especially when you start thinking about things like pedophilia and, well, this is a minor, instead of that, it's a minor attracted person, right? And you go, no, that's a person who that's not good. That there is no good. And so it becomes the less objective truth, the more we embrace the postmodern ideologies or these post-Christian philosophies and ideologies, the more the fuzzy lines of morality become obscure, and that's a really dangerous, slippery slope to go down. And we see this postmodernism take root in our storytelling, in our fairy tales, in our movies. I remember the first time I saw Wicked. It had been out for a year or two, and I was in Chicago, and I got to see the touring company do it. It's many, many years ago. And I loved it, right? I loved the music. I still love the music. I still think it's delightful and fun. But with the postmodern ideologies, it's there is no good, there is no bad, except for what if the good guy is bad? And so I'm like, well, there's a little bit of a problem there, because you say there is no good and there's no bad, but what if the good guy is bad? But you just said there's no good or no bad. And so we see this like with Maleficent, the movie that came out, that, oh, really? Maleficent wasn't the bad guy, right? And so we get this blurring of what is good and what is bad. Yet children need to see that there is good and there is bad, that there is good and there is evil. I remember once hearing Elizabeth Smart, who had been abducted, and now she's an adult. And I heard her once say in an interview, she said, I used to think that there were no bad people in this world, that everyone had good and bad in them. And she said, I changed my perspective after what happened to me. Oh no, there's bad people in this world, and there's evil in this world, which I think is interesting. And so the original fairy tales are very, very black and white, very, very good versus evil. And it enables children to see and to start forming a moral compass within themselves, which I think is interesting because, again, like we saw the controversy over Snow White, where suddenly it wasn't about the princess being rescued, but female empowerment, and like it just became a big mess, and Disney's lost a pretty penny over that one. What I think is interesting too is we do see a lot of allegory to Christianity within the original fairy tales. It wasn't until I was listening to Angelina Stanford talk about this, but even with Snow White, we see some allusion to her partaking. Here's Snow White, and she partakes of a fruit. Does that sound familiar? We're looking at the creation, the fall, and then she goes into this deep, eternal sleep. And it takes a prince, it takes a bridegroom to come and save her because she can't save herself, right? Very Christian imagery there that we need a prince or a savior to come and save, that she needed someone to come and save her, and then they're taken into the heavenly realm. Now, I think the original Disney Snow White, we see some of the allusions to that. But the more that we get in the Disney fairy tales, the more watered down they get, and then they totally change them, like Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast. Like, we see them completely change the fairy tales to the point that they're not recognizable. And even though a lot of them still keep that good versus evil, they become really, really watered down. I even look at like Descendants, that suddenly good is bad and bad is good. And we're seeing that postmodern moral relativism, which becomes confusing for kids. Like, children need to see that there is black and there is white, there is good, there is evil. I think it's interesting. Okay, I love this quote by G.K. Chesterton. Since fairy tales do not tell children the dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children the dragons can be killed. When I read that quote, I was dumbfounded because I'm like, it's true. When these kids come into this world and they're afraid, and we're actually this is a perfect segue into what Bruno Bettelheim says about this. Okay, let me rewind. Bruno Bettelheim was a child psychologist, and he did a long-term study on the effects of children and fairy tales. And one of the objections a lot of people have about the fairy tales is that they are violent. And y'all, I read some fairy tales this past week with my kids that I was like, oh my gosh. And my 13-year-old son is like, I am trying to figure out the lesson in this, which we don't have to share the lessons with our kids. Like, we don't have to get in their faces. Like, the stories in and of themselves will share the lessons. And over time, the children absorb that. It seeps and steeps in them. But he argues that when children, as children are growing up, they have these innate fears. That they have a fear of being separated from their parents. They have a fear of this big, huge, dark, scary world. And for children, the monsters already exist. Like, the boogeyman already exists in their hearts. So it's not like the fairy tales are introducing the boogeyman to children. They already have innate fears. Children are already innately afraid of what's behind the closet. What's in the closet. Even my 9-year-old, every day, she's like, please shut the closet door. One day I said, here, if anything comes out of the closet, here is your sister's sword that she earned, which is the same sword we used to dub Joshua graduated. And I said, if anything comes out, go ahead and slay it, baby. And she's like, got it. I didn't say, oh no, don't be afraid of what's in the dark. I'm like, no, here you go. If you're afraid of anything, go ahead. And right, as children, they do have big imaginations, but they do have these internal fears. And what the fairy tales do is, number one, it confirms those fears. Like, yeah, it's scary to be separated from your parents. It's scary to deal with scary things in the world. But the dragons can be killed. But there is resolution And so it validates their fears and then gives them something to chew on, that there is an answer. I love this by C.S. Lewis, because he reiterates this idea that he says, quote, "Since it's so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. Otherwise, you're making their destiny not brighter, but darker," right? With fairy tales, our kids get to see that the dragons can be defeated, that the witch doesn't win in the end, that there is light at the end of the tunnel, that there is resolution, that there can be happy endings, because otherwise things get really, really bleak. And so he found, and which is, by the way, his book is called Uses of Enchantment, and it's so good. But he argues that the fairy tales actually calm the fears of the children. Although the C.S. Lewis also said, in lines with like the children already, like they already know that there's evil there. He says, C.S. Lewis is, okay, he's accredited with saying this, but nobody knows if he actually said it. But I still think it's a good quote. "Don't ask me where the witch came from. Children are born knowing the witch." And so I think that's, it's true. Like, children are born feeling that sense of like, there is scary out there already. And fairy tales enable us to calm the fears of the children and give them the tools to slay the dragon. Okay, so that question of violence and, do we water down the fairy tales? Do we not? Bruno Bettelheim says, no, don't water them down. Don't. Children have an innate need for a sense of justice. And so even they're a little bit different in that, like a television show that's like horror and gory, which I don't do horror, y'all. Like, my kids are not allowed to watch horror. I don't watch horror. None of my kids want to watch horror anyway. I don't do gore. And some of the fairy tales are super gory. What I observed as we were driving the other day and listened to this one that I had never heard of before, and it's so gruesome. Someone's chopped up. But what I realized is, when we watch it on television or we watch these dark cartoons or whatever, which I, again, am pretty careful about what I put into my brain, they show all of the blood and the guts and the gore. But I realized as I'm listening to the fairy tale, and they talk, this one particular fairy tale, they chop off the grandma's finger, and in my imagination, I didn't imagine blood. And so I asked my kids what they imagined. They're like, "Oh, that's really gruesome." But they didn't imagine blood, but yet the story still was able to teach them that evil could be overcome even with really dark things. So I don't know if that makes any sense. It makes sense in my brain. So it's best if we don't water them down, which is what a lot of, if the translations haven't completely retold or rewritten the fairy tale altogether, a lot of times they'll water down the fairy tale. So recently I'm working on a couple scripts for a small school, and I'm writing some scripts for them to do a fairy tale play. And I brought up to the head of the school, let's discuss some of the fairy tales that you want to include in our, I think they want like a compilation of mini plays. And I said, which ones do you want to include? And I said, would you want Little Red Riding Hood? And she said, yes, but we need to change the ending so that the wolf and Red Riding Hood becomes friends. I'm like, okay. So we're going to have to rewrite the whole story. So how about we don't do Red Riding Hood? And I found this really problematic because she didn't want any bad things to happen to any of the characters, even the bad characters. And so one of the things that Dr. Bettelheim argues is, and actually I don't know if I'm assuming he's a doctor because he was a child psychologist, but one of the things that he argues is that children have this strong sense of morality, right? They want to see justice. They already innately are merciful, but most kids want to have a sense of justice. So I had that conversation with the head of the school, and then I wanted to do a little experiment. So I went to my daughter and I said, who's 9, I said, I'm going to write some plays based on fairy tales. And she said, yep. And I said, what would you think if I changed the ending of the Little Red Riding Hood to have the wolf and Red Riding Hood become friends? And I just sat there. And this was her expression. She went like this. And she got this very perplexed look on her face. And she sat there for a second. And I said, well, what would you think about that? And she's like, I don't know. I'm like, would it bother you? And she's like, I don't know. And she looked bothered. I mean, the look on her face was really concerned, like really, really, really concerned. And I said, maybe I just go ahead and stick with the original ending and the wolf and the original ending, the actual ending, y'all, is that the woodcutter cuts open the wolf. Grandma and Little Red Riding Hood come out of the wolf, and it's actually Little Red Riding Cap. But anyway, they come out of the wolf alive, and then the woodcutter puts rocks in the wolf's belly, sews him up, and then throws him in the river, and he drowns. And so I said, maybe I should just keep the ending as is. And she's like, oh. She literally like let out a sigh, and she goes, good, because I don't think it's okay. And I said, what's not okay? She goes, he ate them. He ate the grandma and Red Riding Hood. That's not okay. Something needed to happen. And so I saw her visibly she was upset. And then there was that sigh of relief in her little 9-year-old mind, like, oh, there is justice. And she was bothered by the fact that I wanted to change the ending so they'd be friends, which I think going back to the moral relativism, like when we water down the fairy tales, we get this sense of, or we change the ending so that there is no justice for the evil. Even in Wicked, where we have this moral ambiguity and maybe good is bad and bad is good, and it causes so much confusion that I even look at in society. So here in Colorado, this happened a few years ago. True story, y'all. It made the news. This guy is running in the mountains, like just on a regular running path, not too far from his neighborhood. And a baby mountain lion, a baby cougar, which is really big. Like they're not little. Like they will kill an adult really fast. Attacks him. So what does the guy do? Well, he defends himself with his bare hands. And he ends up like putting his foot on the cougar's jaw. I mean, he is scratched like crazy and bleeding his guts out. And he puts his foot on the cougar's jaw, ends up like the cougar finally suffocates. And there he's left, just mangled. He had nothing. It wasn't like he brought weapons with him to go running. He had like his AirPods in or whatever, and that was it. Like, and he's just running as a runner would, like he did every day. And he ends up killing this cougar with his bare hands. Y'all, some of the comments were like, how dare this guy kill a cougar? Now, this is not a guy who took a shotgun out looking to kill a cougar. No. This is a guy a baby cougar attacked him, and he was trying to stay alive. And he barely came out alive. Like, he was mangled pretty stinking bad. Ended up in the hospital, right? And that is what we get with moral relativism. That there's no sense of yeah, well, the right thing to do in that situation is to protect yourself. Okay. Or just be eaten by the cougar, and that's fine, And so again, when we water down the fairy tales, it doesn't do our children any justice. And when we try to make them soft and cushy and sweet, the children don't see the justice that they innately want and need to see, that enables them to see that the dragon can be killed. If we don't kill the dragon, then we're still left in a very scary world. Do you see what I'm saying? Am I making any sense? And some of you totally might disagree with me, and that is fine. Don't read your kids Grimm's fairy tales. Anyway, the other thing that is brought up in Tending to the Heart of Virtue and in Uses of Enchantment is you and I as parents do not need to explain the fairy tales. We do not need to try to suck out what the morality is with the fairy tales. As I mentioned before, we just share them. We read them with the kids and let them come to conclusions on their own over time. They're not going to stop, if a child is struggling to lie, which age 8 is usually the time that I see kids start to like experiment with telling fibs, right? Reading Pinocchio the first time may not stop them from that initial like practicing, trying out lying. But over time, these stories accumulate as our kids are put in front of knights in shining armor, and they're put in front of heroic characters, and they're put in front of wonderful literary heroes and heroines. They start to develop these ideological, holding to the Christian ideological pre-postmodern ideas. Joshua brought up Atticus Finch and Reading to Kill a Mockingbird in the first part of my interview with him. Joshua, for those of you, this is your first podcast episode of mine. Joshua is my 18-year-old son who just graduated. He's my first homeschool child to graduate. We pulled the kids 5 years ago. And he brought up that being face to face with Atticus Finch and seeing the heroism and the bravery affected him. For our younger children, that's what fairy tales can do for them. And then for us, y'all, they're still so delightful. And I was still like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Again, some of these fairy tales I had never heard in my entire life. So let's talk about for just a second. Yeah, so our kids need fairy tales. They need fairy tales to know. They already know the evil exists, but they need to know that the dragon can be slain. It helps them gain courage. It helps them learn virtue. It's like a tea that it seeps, and over time that steeping shapes who they are over the years as we read with them. So for fun, before I go into what to read to the kids, which fairy tales you want to read, because not all translations are created equal. I want to say I have a free download with the quotes by C.S. Lewis about the dragon. G.K. Chesterton about the dragon being slain, and then C.S. Lewis's quote about the need for knights in shining armor, to know that knights exist. I made some really cool bookmarks. They're in the show notes. For those of you who are signed up for my newsletter, I'll be emailing those out to you so you don't have to go in and find them in the show notes and then download them. But it's a free PDF download, so you can print them out on cardstock and have your own bookmarks to put in your fairy tale books as you read. So let's talk about which versions to get. And I'm going to include these in the show notes so that you can look them up, get them from your library, you can purchase them, however you want to obtain them, get them off Amazon. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to me how you get them. Okay. Jack Zipes. Now, Jack Zipes is very Marxist. However, I wouldn't read his personally. If you're a Marxist, that's one thing, and you're probably listening to the wrong podcast. But his commentary on the fairy tales, don't love those. But his translations are actually really, really good. And this is what Vigen, Dr. Guroian suggested. This is the one we've been listening to. It's the Complete Tales of Brothers Grimm by Bantam Books, and it's the Jack Zipes translation. Okay, again, all of these are going to be in the show notes, as well as the free PDF download of the bookmarks with the quotes. And then, so Jack Zipes translation, again, don't read his commentary. Don't pick up any of his commentaries unless you ascribe to the Marxist ideologies. But, which is why he didn't like as he's translating, which is why he didn't like them, because they're very, very infused with Christianity all over the place, like allusion and allegory, and which the kids may not understand at the beginning, but as they get older, again, it starts to marinate in their souls. So Jack Zipes, Complete Tales of Brothers Grimm by Bantam Books. Another really good one is David Luke, Penguin Classics, Brothers Grimm Selected Tales. And just so you know, like the Jack Zipes one, it's like on Audible, it's like 12 hours. That's why we're reading fairy tales all summer. Like this is our read aloud is fairy tales. We're going through all of them, and we're all real excited because some of them are really gruesome, but the kids do well with them. They don't imagine the blood. David Luke, Penguin Classics, Brothers Grimm Selected Tales. Eric Christian Haugard for Hans Christian Andersen. He has a collection of stories by Hans Christian Andersen. I'm going to look at that one. If you want to go into Victorian fairy tales, look at Michael Patrick Hearn's book, The Victorian Fairy Tale Book, published by Pantheon Books. Again, that's Victorian Fairy Tales. The Victorian Fairy Tale Book by Michael Patrick Hearn, by Pantheon Books. And then Iona and Peter Opie, Classic Fairy Tales by Oxford University Press. And so those are some fairy tales. Also, if you've never read anything by George MacDonald, y'all, before I started homeschooling, I had never even heard of George MacDonald, but his tales are delightful and fabulous. And then you could also look at, actually John Ruskin I believe he only wrote one fairy tale, and I'll include that one in the show notes as well, but I haven't read that one yet. But I'm quickly falling in love with George MacDonald's fairy tales as well as his novels. We're reading The Princess and the Goblin right now. Oh my goodness. So delightful. So those are a few translations and anthologies that you can pick up from the library. And y'all, start reading fairy tales. I just want to end one more time with this quote by C.S. Lewis. Actually, I'll end with two quotes. Someday, you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. C.S. Lewis. That's you and me. That's you and me, mamas and grandmas and some dads and grandpas. It's time for us to start reading fairy tales again. And finally, I do want to end with this quote because I do love this quote so much. I've referred to it over and over and over again. Fairy tales do not tell children the dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children the dragons can be killed. G.K. Chesterton. Mamas and papas, grandmas and grandpas, you are doing so much better than you think you are. You got this.